8 o'clock in the morning. The main lobby of Evermont Industries gleamed like a giant mirror where the lights reflected off expensive shoes and proud smiles. Amid the busy crowd, a woman stepped in quiet enough to disturb the rush of the place. Grace Miller, 33 years old, wore simple white blouse and gray slacks, her hair neatly tied back. On her chest hung a badge that read, Trainee. No one knew who she was. No one paid attention to her until a cup of Coca-Cola flew straight toward her. The dark liquid burst, splashing across her face, running down her neck, sticking to her brown hair. The sweet scent filled the air. Laughter broke out, sharp, quick, and cruel. "Oops," a man's voice said smugly. "Thought you were janitorial staff." It was Ethan Brooks, 24, the son of a senior executive wearing an expensive blazer and the smile of someone who had never known fear. He stood in the middle of the lobby, holding the empty plastic cup, his friends laughing behind him. Grace said nothing. She didn't wipe her face. She just stood still, tilting her head slightly as the sticky drops rolled slowly down her chin. Around her, all eyes turned, some curious, some amused. A girl at the reception desk covered her mouth, about to step forward, but stopped when her superior glared at her. An old security guard clenched his fist, then loosened it again. No one dared interfere. Grace exhaled softly, a heavy breath, calm and steady. She bent down, picked up the empty cup at her feet, and placed it on a nearby table. Her movement was slow, deliberate, as if she didn't hear the laughter around her. "She looks like she just crawled out of the basement." Someone whispered just loud enough for others to hear. Grace didn't respond. In her brown eyes there were no tears, no anger, only silence. The kind of silence that suddenly made the room feel suffocating. Ethan smirked, thinking he had won. He spun the empty cup in his hand, glancing around for more spectators, and sneered, "Welcome to Evermont, trainee." Grace tilted her head slightly, meeting his eyes just long enough for his confident smile to falter for half a second. Then she turned away. Each step echoed softly against the marble floor, leaving behind the scent of cola and a heavy silence. A few people started whispering, "She's not going to react. Maybe she's afraid of losing her job." But only one person. Margaret Evans, a long-time advisor of the company, watched with different eyes. In that straight posture, she didn't see weakness. She saw quiet strength. On the upper floor behind the glass walls of the executive office, a man stood watching. Aaron Blake, 36 years old, the youngest CEO in Evermont's history. He didn't know who the woman was, but something in her composure made him pause. No fear, no pleading, just control. Meanwhile, Ethan watched Grace step into the employee elevator and laughed again, his voice dripping with mockery. "Don't forget to mop the lobby too, trainee." The elevator doors closed, swallowing his taunt, and leaving behind a strange emptiness, as if the room had just witnessed something beyond its understanding. Inside the elevator, Grace looked at her reflection in the dim mirror. Her blouse clung to her skin, her collar damp, but her eyes were as calm as before. She wasn't angry. She wasn't sad. She whispered softly, barely audible, "People only show who they really are when they think they're above others." And when the elevator stopped, she stepped out quietly, just as she had entered, carrying with her a storm no one yet knew was coming. The elevator stopped at the 14th floor. The doors opened, and the familiar rhythm of office life filled the air, the scent of coffee blending with the sound of keyboards, creating a symphony of noise, haste, and indifference. Grace Miller stepped out, her white blouse still stained, a strand of hair clinging to her collar, but her stride showed no sign of hesitation. No one knew that behind that calm exterior was a woman who came from a world of power and discipline. She was not merely a trainee, as her badge claimed. She was the wife of Thomas Miller, 52 years old, the founder of Evermont Industries, one of the leading technology and finance corporations in the Midwest. 3 years earlier, Thomas had suffered a mild stroke and decided to step back from the spotlight, leaving management in the hands of a younger team. But Grace, who had always remained away from public attention, began to notice that Evermont was changing, and not for the better. She had heard rumors of internal discrimination, of people using authority to trample others beneath them. And so Grace chose the only way she believed would reveal the truth to start again from the bottom. A week before she began, Thomas had warned her, "You don't need to do this. They won't even recognize you." Grace had smiled gently and replied, "That's exactly why I have to go. If you are the soul of the company, then I want to know if its heart is still beating." From the very beginning, she had quietly applied for the internal trainee program. No one had checked her background carefully. A name like Miller among thousands of applications drew no attention, especially since she hadn't used the title Mrs. Now in the bright white office. Grace looked around at the people nearby, young faces full of confidence but cold and detached. Her hand tightened slightly. She wasn't angry about the Coke. She was angry at the way people reacted to it. The laughter, the indifferent glances, the silence that made them accomplices. On the 18th floor inside the executive office, Aaron Blake was watching the security footage from the main lobby. He replayed the moment when Grace stood still, saying nothing, showing no reaction. "Who is she?" he asked his assistant. "Just a new trainee, sir." "No," Aaron replied quietly, eyes still fixed on the screen. "There's something in her eyes, something that doesn't belong to a newcomer." At midday, when most of the office had gone out for lunch, Grace stayed behind. She opened her laptop and browsed through the internal system project lists, organizational charts, financial reports she had quietly requested access to. On the screen, the numbers appeared cold and sterile. She noticed questionable entries, suspicious bonuses awarded to regional directors. A thought crossed her mind. Evermont is rotting from the inside. She saved the documents, closed the laptop, and when she lifted her head, she saw someone standing in front of her. Margaret Evans, the senior advisor, her eyes sharp but kind. "You're Grace Miller." Grace froze for a moment. "Yes, don't worry. I know who you are." Margaret's voice was low but steady. She placed a thick folder on the desk in front of Grace, its corner marked with a red stamp that read, "Confidential." "Mr. Thomas asked me to deliver this to you. Don't let anyone see it. And be careful. Not everyone here is loyal to him." Grace's hand trembled slightly as she touched the folder. Inside was the restructuring plan for the entire Chicago branch, the draft she and her husband had discussed 2 years earlier. She knew this was the moment to begin. That afternoon, as she stepped out of the room, the late sunlight stretched long across the tiled floor. Golden rays touched her dark shoes, glimmering like a signal of something about to happen. On the ground floor, Ethan was still laughing loudly, retelling the morning joke to his group of friends. No one noticed that on the 14th floor, a quiet woman was opening the first pages of a change that would soon tear away every mask within the company. The next morning, the Chicago sky was painted in shades of silver-gray sunlight, filtered through the massive glass panels of Evermont Industries. The air carried a chill, the kind that lingered in places where pride was colder than temperature. Grace Miller walked through the lobby quiet as a shadow. Her white blouse had been cleaned, her hair tied neatly, her face free of any trace from the day before. But there was something no one could see beneath that calm surface her observation had begun. At the reception desk, a few employees whispered as she passed. "She actually dared to come back. Shameless, if it were me, I'd have quit already." Grace heard every word, but she didn't stop walking. When the elevator doors opened, a group of young employees stood blocking the entrance. The scent of expensive perfume filled the small space. The woman leading them, Vanessa Cole, 29 years old, with platinum bob hair and crimson lipstick, gave Grace a slow glance from head to toe, her smile curved like a blade. Sorry, Vanessa said loudly enough for everyone to hear. This elevator is for full-time staff. You can use the service elevator in the back. It suits your outfit better. The group behind her burst into laughter. Grace stayed silent, her hand still resting on the control button. She looked at Vanessa, not angry, not embarrassed, just a calm, sharp gaze that made the other woman's smile falter for a split second. "It's fine," Grace said softly, her tone steady and smooth as still water. "I prefer the stairs anyway. At least there aren't so many people pretending to be polite." Then she turned and walked away, leaving behind a line of stunned faces. Vanessa watched her go, furious at being shut down in front of everyone. "Who does she think she is talking like that?" A man beside her. Paul chuckled. "Just a useless trainee. Forget it." But Vanessa didn't laugh. For a fleeting moment, she felt something strange inside, an unexplainable flicker of fear. By noon, in the employee lounge, the marketing team gathered around the coffee machine. Ethan Brooks appeared retelling the Coke Girl's story with amusement. She just stood there like a statue, couldn't say a word. Maybe we should hire her to promote soft drinks. Laughter filled the room. Cups clinking. Just then the door opened. Grace walked in. No one expected her to appear right in the middle of the story. The room went silent. The only sound was the soft dripping from the coffee machine. Grace walked straight to the sink, grabbed a paper towel to dry her hands, her voice calm but cutting through the silence. "Thanks for reminding me. At least your Coca-Cola was useful. It helped me remember who enjoys mocking others the most." Ethan froze. The laughter died instantly. Uneasy glances spread through the room. Grace folded the paper towel, dropped it in the trash, and walked out without looking back. In the hallway, whispers followed. "She's not as simple as she looks. Maybe she's from the internal audit team." But only Margaret Evans, standing from afar by the third-floor railing, quietly watched. In Grace's eyes, she saw something only those who had once held power would recognize: the calmness of someone who knows exactly where she stands. Late in the afternoon, Vanessa stepped into the elevator and found herself face to face with Grace once more. The air between them thickened. Still hanging around, Vanessa sneered. Grace replied softly but firmly, "I'm not hanging around. I'm observing." Observing what Vanessa asked. Grace looked straight at her, her brown eyes glinting under the ceiling light. "To see who's pushing themselves out of this company." The elevator doors opened. Grace stepped out, leaving Vanessa standing alone in tense silence. That night in his office, Aaron Blake replayed the lobby footage once again. The glow from the screen reflected on his face. "She's different from the others," he murmured. His assistant asked, "What do you mean?" Aaron replied quietly, "The weak get scared." But not her. She's waiting. She knows what's coming. What Aaron didn't realize was that his words were a prophecy, one that would soon come true as a storm quietly began to form, born from the very woman they had once mocked. It was 7:40 in the evening. The golden light spilled across the 20th floor lobby of Evermont Industries, reflecting on the granite floor with a glow that was both cold and beautiful, like the polished edge of a sharpened blade. Glasses of wine clinked, laughter mingled with shallow compliments, and the air was thick with ambition. It was the company's networking cocktail night, where young managers flaunted their influence, and those hungry for promotion began their quiet hunt. In one corner of the room, Grace Miller stood alone holding a glass of water. She wore a simple gray shirt, her hair tied low. No makeup, no jewelry. Amid the glossy crowd and hollow laughter, she looked like a wrong note in a loud symphony, quiet, modest, yet impossible to ignore. Across the room, Ethan Brooks was still retelling the legendary Coke story, his laughter smooth and loud. Beside him, Vanessa Cole laughed too, her voice sharp, high, and empty, like glass shattering on tile. Who does she think she is? Just an employee talking like that. Grace heard every word, but instead of turning toward them, she gently swirled the glass in her hand, listening to the soft clinking of ice against the rim. Such a small sound, yet to her it was a reminder. Stay calm. Observe. Let them reveal who they are. On the other side of the room, Margaret Evans, the senior advisor at 58, stood by a pillar holding a thick folder. The light reflected off her neatly cut gray hair and silver-rimmed glasses. She didn't laugh, didn't speak, only watched. The look of someone who had seen hundreds of faces like these, smiling, flattering, and then betraying. When her gaze landed on Grace, she paused. Not because she recognized her, but because she recognized the attitude. The upright posture, the way she made no effort to impress, and the eyes that missed nothing. This woman doesn't belong here, Margaret thought. She's studying it. She started walking toward her, the sound of her heels tapping lightly on the marble floor, each step steady as a heartbeat. Ms. Miller. Her voice was low, firm enough to be heard over the chatter. Grace turned and gave a slight nod. Yes, that's me. Margaret glanced around. The room was noisy, yet in that moment it felt as if only the two of them existed. She handed Grace the thick folder stamped boldly in red, "Confidential. Direct orders from Mr. Thomas Miller." Margaret said softly, her tone serious. "You are to review the restructuring plan for the Chicago branch before tonight's closed meeting." Grace froze for a moment. Her heartbeat quickened, but her voice stayed calm. "I understand." Nearby, a young man wearing a tie that was too tight overheard them and turned sharply. "Wait, who did you say? Thomas Miller? You mean the Thomas Miller?" Margaret shot him a look, just one that made him go silent instantly. Grace took the folder carefully, tucked it into her bag, and said quietly, "Thank you. No one will see it." Margaret nodded slightly. "And don't trust anyone here. They're waiting for you to fail." As Grace left the room, the sound of laughter and jazz music still echoed behind her, but she no longer heard it. She walked down the long corridor lined with glass, the city lights shimmering beyond thousands of glowing windows, flickering like eyes, watching her every step. In a small break room upstairs, she opened the folder. Inside was a detailed plan, eliminating redundant departments, replacing key personnel, restructuring financial control. Names appeared in red on the list: Ethan Brooks, Vanessa Cole, Paul Whitmore. Grace took a deep breath. What she felt wasn't satisfaction, but a heavy sadness. She had once believed this company stood for discipline and integrity. Now it was nothing more than a polished shell hiding decay. That night, when the clock struck 10, the lights of Evermont began to dim. Grace still sat by the window, the folder open before her, the city glittering beyond the glass. She knew that from the moment she received that file, her silence would no longer be a defense, it would become her weapon. Tuesday morning. The air inside Evermont's office was thick with the smell of coffee and ambition. Every desk was its own tiny stage where everyone pretended to be busy, but was really just performing the illusion of importance. Among them, Grace Miller appeared like an unexpected pause in a noisy symphony. Her gray blouse was spotless, her hair neatly tied back, no makeup, no perfume. She arrived early, brewed herself a cup of black coffee, and sat quietly in the corner, reviewing the restructuring plan Margaret Evans had given her the night before. But peace never lasted long in a place where ego outweighed decency. Around 9 in the morning, the break room door swung open, followed by the sharp click of heels and shrill laughter. A group of 4 marketing employees entered, dressed in trendy outfits, heavy perfume, clinging to the air, their voices dripping with arrogance and disdain. Leading the pack was Ethan Brooks, the man who had once thrown a Coke in her face. Behind him was Tina Walsh, 32 head of creative, known for using sarcasm as sport. "Oh, look who it is. Our little trainee. Tina's tone was sugary and cruel, her eyes scanning Grace's blouse. New shirt. Still tragically simple. The group burst out laughing. Ethan crossed his arms, leaning against the counter, his tone mocking. You know grace in this industry appearance matters. Maybe you should apply for the cleaning staff they're hiring. Another woman raised her phone, aiming the camera. Smile for the caption, Monday Mood Low Budget Edition. The flash went off, followed by laughter, sharp metallic cutting through the silence like a blade. Grace set her coffee cup down on the table. She didn't look at them. She didn't avoid them either. She simply stood up, took a paper towel, and wiped a small splash of water near the coffee machine. Her voice was calm, low, but clear. Do any of you ever wonder if real humor doesn't come from making someone else feel small? No one answered. Ethan smirked, pretending to be unfazed. We were just joking, don't take it so seriously. Grace turned her gaze to him, her brown eyes deep and steady, holding his for a few seconds. Maybe because you've never been the one laughed at. When you finally know how that feels, it won't be funny anymore. She folded the paper towel, dropped it into the trash, and walked out. The door closed behind her, leaving only the hum of the air conditioner and an uneasy quiet that settled over the room. Tina glanced at Ethan, trying to break the tension. Who does she think she is? But her voice had lost its confidence. Someone in the group murmured, There's something different about her eyes. She doesn't look scared. It's like she's counting down. Counting down to what I don't know. But it gave me chills. On the 18th floor, Margaret Evans was in a meeting with the advisory board when her phone buzzed. A new message appeared. Everything is unfolding as you said. I just need time. GM. Margaret smiled faintly, a quiet trust flickering in her eyes. Let them show themselves, she said softly. When the curtain falls, there'll be no need to speak, just watch. Later that afternoon, before leaving the office, Grace stopped by the copy room to collect a few reports. Behind her, two colleagues whispered, She's strange. Too calm, like she knows what's coming. Grace smiled faintly and replied without turning around. That's because I do. The neon lights glinted on the folder in her hands, the red stamp, confidential, shining like a warning. Inside, the first names on the termination list remained there ready to be set in motion. That night, when the entire building had gone dark, the security camera caught the image of a small woman stepping out of the elevator, the faint gust of air brushing the hem of her gray blouse. No one could hear what she said, but if one listened closely enough, they might catch the whisper, Never mistake silence for weakness. Wednesday morning. The sky was heavy with clouds and the wind howled against the tall glass panels of Evermont Industries. On the 15th floor, where Grace had been temporarily assigned, the office buzzed like a restless beehive. Emails, reports, phone calls. Everything moved quickly, nervously, and with a certain falseness. Grace Miller sat at a small desk by the window, quietly observing. She didn't speak much, but her eyes, the eyes of someone who understood the architecture of power, saw straight through every layer of pretense. On her screen, she opened internal data files that no one realized she had access to. A small line of text appeared in the corner, Access Level Executive Override. Her brows furrowed slightly. The first sign. This function only existed for executive management, yet the system under Thomas Miller's silent order had granted her the access. It was a perfect disguise, but now a few people were starting to notice something strange. Around 10 in the morning, Paul Whitmore, head of finance, approached her desk with a stack of reports. He was in his 40s with sharp eyes and a smirk that reeked of arrogance. Grace, you printed the wrong report. That one's for management, not trainees. Grace looked up, her voice calm but clear. I didn't print it by mistake. I'm reviewing the discrepancies between last quarter and this one. Paul raised an eyebrow. Reviewing? You think you have the right to do that? She turned the screen toward him, pointing directly at a section of data. The off-plan bonus allocations from your department in March $35,000. I just want to know why. The air froze. Paul gave a forced chuckle, but beads of sweat had already formed near his temple. You have no authority to ask that question. Perhaps not, Grace replied evenly, but the audit department will. Paul took a half-step back, his tone sharp. Are you threatening me? Grace shook her head and calmly closed the file. I don't need to threaten anyone. As soon as Paul walked away, a young IT engineer named Noah Reed, about 26, approached her hesitantly. Who are you really? No one else has that level of access in the system. Grace looked at him, smiling faintly. Let's just say I'm fixing things that should never have been broken. Then she walked away, leaving Noah frozen in the hallway. By noon, the whispers had begun to spread. That trainee has access to restricted files. She questioned the head of finance about misconduct. Someone said she's close to Margaret Evans. The rumors slithered through every department like thin smoke. Ethan heard them and laughed dismissively. It's just a stunt for attention. Someone with no power, no status, thinks she can make a difference. Vanessa stayed silent. For the first time, she wasn't sure he was right. That afternoon, Grace was summoned to a meeting on the 19th floor, the level reserved for senior management. The receptionist stopped her with a cold smile. This floor is for managers only. You should head back to the trainee area. Grace smiled lightly, her tone gentle but firm. I understand. But if you don't believe me, you can call upstairs. They're expecting me. Without waiting for a reply, she continued walking. A minute later, the phone on the receptionist's desk rang. A man's voice came through from above, low and steady. Send Grace Miller up immediately. The receptionist froze. In the conference room, Aaron Blake, the young CEO, stood as Grace entered. No one knew why he did it, just a simple gesture, but to others, it was a sign of respect. Aaron didn't speak much. He simply looked at her for a moment, then said, You have something I need. Grace placed the folder on the table. And you? She replied softly, Have something I need to know. That night, Margaret received a short message from Grace. The warm-up is over. They've started to notice. Margaret looked at the text and smiled faintly. Outside, the city lights shimmered against the glass towers, and somewhere within that labyrinth of power, a quiet woman was turning the chessboard on the very players who thought they were in control. 8 o'clock in the evening. The grand lobby of Evermont Industries gleamed under golden light. The company's internal party for young employees was in full swing, wine glasses, overflowing jazz music humming softly in the air, and fake smiles filling every corner of the room. Amid the laughter and the clinking of glasses, Grace Miller stood alone by the buffet table, holding a glass of water, her eyes following the crowd like someone watching a play whose ending she already knew by heart. She was silent, present but invisible, like a passing breeze. No one cared to notice. Across the room, Ethan Brooks, dressed in a new suit, and his hair slicked back, was laughing loudly with his colleagues. He had just finished retelling the Coke Girl story, sending the table into fits of laughter. She's probably quit by now, Ethan declared proudly. No one with any dignity would come back after that. But his laughter stopped the moment he saw Grace walking through the crowd, calm, composed, the light from the chandelier glinting off her glass of water. The atmosphere shifted subtly. Those who remembered that day exchanged uneasy looks. Some frowned, others fell quiet. She's still here, someone whispered. Ethan squinted the corner of his mouth, twisting into a smirk that was half mockery, half discomfort. He lifted a new glass of Coca-Cola high into the air, his voice carrying across the room. Look who's here, our guest of honor. Maybe she'd like a welcome drink? A few people chuckled awkwardly. Others looked away. Grace stopped in the center of the room. The music and chatter seemed to slow, as if the air itself was holding its breath. Ethan walked toward her one deliberate step at a time, and before anyone could react, he tilted the glass. The dark liquid splashed out droplets, scattering through the light like shards of glass before landing squarely on Grace's blouse, her hair, her face. Silence. Then laughter erupted, shrill and cruel, echoing like shattering crystal. Oh my God, she didn't even move. This time she's definitely quitting. Grace stood still. Not a word, not a movement, only the reflection of white light in her brown eyes, deep, steady, and cold. Ethan laughed weakly, his voice trembling with unease. Oh, come on, nothing to say. Grace looked at him. Her gaze sliced through the air, sharp and unflinching, cutting through his arrogance like a knife. She said nothing, simply placed her glass down on the table so quietly that it made no sound. Across the room, Margaret Evans stood among the crowd, her face expressionless. She didn't intervene. She only glanced toward the corner of the ceiling where the security camera blinked with a red light. Good, she thought. Let everyone see who they really are. At the same moment, on the 20th floor inside the glass office, Aaron Blake was watching the live feed from the event. When he saw the Coke spill, he stood up abruptly. Turn off the music! Keep the wide-angle camera rolling! His assistant panicked. Sir, should we step in? Aaron shook his head. No, they're about to destroy themselves. Down in the lobby, Grace reached for a napkin, wiped the liquid from her collar, then lifted her head, her eyes still locked on Ethan. The room was silent now, the laughter swallowed by the walls. Her voice broke the stillness, slow, calm, and precise. You know there are things that once spilled a second time can never be washed away. Not from clothes, but from dignity. Ethan froze. No one laughed. Grace placed the napkin on the table, turned, and walked away. The lights shimmered against her hair, glinting off the damp spots on her blouse, forming a faint, strange halo around her as she moved. When the lobby doors closed behind her, Margaret took out her phone and sent a message to Aaron. Start the playback for the board. No edits. 10 minutes later, the meeting room on the 20th floor lit up. 12 board members sat in silence as the screen showed Grace being drenched in Coke for the second time, still standing tall, still calm, surrounded by cruel laughter. Someone whispered softly, "Who is she?" Aaron replied, his voice low but resolute. The person we will all have to bow to. That night in the elevator on her way home, Grace leaned her head against the glass wall and closed her eyes. She didn't cry. She wasn't angry. She simply thought, sometimes to expose the true face of a place, you have to let them pour the Coke one more time. The next morning, Evermont woke up in chaos. The glass towers that once gleamed with pride now trembled with whispers. Every corridor buzzed with rumors. Every desk carried a hum of disbelief. Those who had once laughed at Grace now spoke in hushed, trembling tones. They say the board saw everything. I heard she knows the CEO personally. Know someone said she's connected to someone even higher. The tension in the air was thick enough to silence even the most talkative employees. No one dared to speak her name too loudly, as if invoking it might summon consequences. On the top floor, the heavy doors of the executive conference room closed with a quiet thud. Inside, Aaron Blake stood at the head of the long mahogany table facing 12 board members whose expressions were pale and uneasy. The lights dimmed and the large screen on the wall flickered to life. The footage began to play the scene from last night. Ethan Brooks leaning forward with a smirk, the Coke tilting from his hand, the brown liquid catching the golden light before splashing across Grace's face and white blouse. The sound of laughter filled the room, cruel and echoing. Then came the silence. The moment Grace stood still, dripping, her head held high, her eyes steady and unbroken. When the screen finally went black, the silence that followed was suffocating. Aaron's voice cut through it, calm but edged with authority. You're not watching an employee being humiliated. You're watching Grace Whitmore Miller, wife of Evermont's founder and this company's largest shareholder. A murmur swept across the table. A director gasped audibly. That can't be true. Another man's voice cracked. We threw Coke on Thomas Miller's wife. Aaron nodded once, the faintest movement, but it hit like thunder. You did. And tonight she returns to take the position that was always hers, chairwoman of Evermont Industries. No one spoke after that. The weight of shame hung in the air like fog. At 10 o'clock, the elevator doors opened on the ground floor. The sound of her heels echoed softly across the marble. Grace stepped out wearing a crisp white suit, tailored elegant, understated. There was nothing ostentatious about her, yet her presence commanded the space effortlessly. Conversation stopped mid-sentence. The crowd seemed to part naturally as she walked through the air around her, calm but electric. The receptionist at the front desk swallowed hard before speaking. Mrs. Miller, the board is expecting you on the 20th floor. Grace smiled gently, her tone kind yet composed. Just Grace is fine. I came to talk, not to judge. Her words carried warmth, but also strength, the kind that needed no explanation. Upstairs, the boardroom doors opened. Aaron Blake was the first to rise, bowing his head slightly. Welcome back, Chairwoman Miller. One by one, the 12 members stood. Grace walked slowly to the head of the table, her movements measured precise. She set a single folder down and looked around the room. Interesting. She began, her voice calm, but cutting through the air like silk over steel. Just a few days ago, the people sitting in this room treated me as if I were invisible. And now, everyone stands. A director cleared his throat, his hands trembling slightly. Madam, we didn't know. Grace raised a hand lightly, stopping him mid-sentence. You didn't know, she said softly, because you never cared to know. In this company, people see job titles, not people. You've built a culture that rewards arrogance and punishes humility. Her tone didn't rise yet. Each word landed with the weight of truth. No one dared to look her in the eye. Grace opened the folder, turning the first page. That ends today. From this moment forward, Evermont will not be a place where power excuses cruelty. Respect will no longer be optional. It will not be a reward. It will be the foundation. Her voice carried evenly deliberate, filling the room with a quiet finality that no one could challenge. Downstairs at that very moment, a wave of notifications hit inboxes across the company. Internal announcement. Ethan Brooks suspended pending review. Vanessa Cole under behavioral assessment. Tina Walsh transferred to the ethics committee. No explanations were given. None were needed. Silence spread through every department, not of fear, but of awakening. When the meeting concluded, Aaron approached Grace by the door. His expression was one of respect. You've made the entire company see itself, perhaps for the first time. Grace looked at him, her voice soft but resolute. No one is beyond mistakes, Aaron, but the greatest failure is forgetting our humanity. Evermont doesn't need more profits. It needs its conscience back. She smiled faintly, her hand resting on the doorknob. And that starts now. As she stepped into the corridor, sunlight poured through the glass walls, coating her in a golden glow. She was no longer the woman mocked as the Coke girl, no longer the trainee no one noticed. She was Grace Miller, the woman who turned humiliation into strength, and in doing so, taught an empire the meaning of respect. Thursday morning. News spread faster than the wind through the glass floors of Evermont Industries. The woman who got drenched in Coke is the founder's wife. That single sentence slithered through every hallway, every meeting room, every break room where coffee cups trembled in stunned hands. It echoed across cubicles and instant messages, growing into a hum of disbelief that filled the building. Those who once laughed at her now couldn't meet Grace Miller's eyes. The same people who had whispered insults now avoided her shadow. Grace entered the office that morning with 2 assistants, and Margaret Evans beside her, not as a victim returning to her workplace, but as a quiet force bringing accountability. The sound of her heels against the marble floor was enough to silence conversations. In her hand, she carried a crimson folder, the first list of the Internal Culture Review Program. It wasn't just paperwork, it was the blueprint for change. She opened her laptop, her voice steady yet sharp as glass. "We'll start with the marketing department. I want every behavioral report, every internal review, and all anonymous complaints from the past 12 months. The head of human resources hesitated, his voice trembling. "Madam, these are high-level confidential files. We'll need authorization." Grace looked up, her tone unshaken. "High-level is me." The words were calm, but they rippled through the room like a shockwave. No one dared to speak after that. The hum of keyboards faltered. Even the air seemed to grow still, as if the entire building was holding its breath. By noon, the first internal announcement was sent. Internal notification employees. Ethan Brooks and Tina Walsh are suspended pending investigation for violations of professional ethics. All relevant departments are to cooperate fully with the Special Audit Committee under the direct oversight of Chairwoman Grace Miller. The building froze. No one laughed. No one dared to even whisper the nickname Coke Girl. Every conversation now carried the weight of fear and reflection. Eyes met, and quickly turned away, each person silently wondering who would be next. On the third floor, Vanessa Cole sat at her desk, her face pale, her eyes rimmed red. In her trembling hands was a white envelope freshly delivered by courier. Inside was a formal notice temporary suspension from the position of brand manager with a single cold line typed below time required to reassess attitude and behavior within the workplace. Vanessa unlocked her company tablet and replayed the internal video from that night. On the screen, Grace stood silently in the lobby, Coke dripping to the floor, her eyes calm and defiant under the lights. And in that moment, Vanessa finally understood it wasn't authority that frightened her, nor retribution. It was dignity. That afternoon, Grace visited the IT department. The room grew quiet when she entered. A young technician, Noah Reed, the same man who had discreetly warned her about suspicious system activity, looked up nervously. "Mrs. Miller, I had nothing to do with what they did." Grace smiled gently, setting a folder on his desk. "I know," she said softly. "And I also know you were the one who sent me the server logs when they tried to erase the camera footage." His eyes widened in shock. Grace's expression didn't waver. "Thank you, Noah. Evermont needs people like you." Before she left, she placed a printed document on his desk. It was a promotion letter, appointment of Noah Reed as Regional Data Systems Manager. He stood motionless as she walked away, his eyes glassy with disbelief and gratitude. In the CEO's office, Aaron Blake sat behind his desk, scrolling through hundreds of emails flooding his inbox messages of appreciation sent to Grace from across departments. Receptionists, night shift, janitors, security guards, cafeteria workers. The people who had long been invisible now felt seen. He exhaled deeply, shaking his head. "In just 2 days, she's done what I couldn't in 2 years." Margaret, standing by the window, folded her arms, a proud smile tugging at her lips. "That's because she doesn't teach fear," she said softly. "She reminds them of who they used to be." As the sun began to set, Grace walked past the same lobby where it had all begun, the place where a Coke had been poured, where laughter once filled the air like poison. The floor was spotless now, but she paused, her eyes drifting to the empty space, as if she could still hear the echoes of that cruel laughter. Her lips parted into a faint smile and she whispered, "Thank you for pouring that Coke on me. It showed me who truly deserves to stay." A young employee passing by overheard her words and stopped, startled. Grace turned her expression gentle. "Don't be afraid to be good," she said kindly, "even when others laugh at you. Sometimes kindness is what terrifies them the most." That evening, more than 20 termination emails were sent out quietly, efficiently, without announcement or ceremony. No one protested, No one questioned, but everyone in Evermont knew that a chapter had ended the era of arrogance, deceit, and cruelty. And as Grace walked down the corridor in her crisp white blouse, her steps silent yet commanding, every gaze followed her with unspoken reverence. She didn't need to prove her authority. She embodied it. She didn't need power to show power. All she needed was dignity strong enough to make an empire bow its head. Late afternoon. The last rays of sunlight bathed the lavender garden behind the Evermont Industries building in gold. The flowers swayed gently in the breeze, releasing a faint fragrance that felt like a memory. On the rooftop, Grace Miller stood by the railing looking out over the city of Chicago as it slowly faded into night. The distant sound of car horns blended with the steady rhythm of her heartbeat, the heartbeat of a woman who had walked through storms in silence. A week had passed since the cleansing. Evermont was quieter than ever before. The mocking laughter was gone, replaced by an atmosphere of seriousness and respect. The system had been rebuilt. HR policies were reformed, and hundreds of thank you emails filled the chairwoman's inbox, all beginning with the same words: "Thank you for helping us see ourselves again." The rooftop door opened, and Thomas Miller appeared, his silver hair gleaming under the evening light, his tall figure calm, his eyes filled with tenderness and pride. He stopped beside her, his hands clasped behind his back. "I always knew you would do it," he said softly. Grace smiled, her voice as light as a breath. "It wasn't me. They realized it themselves. I only showed them the mirror." Thomas looked at her, the golden sunset casting its glow across her face. "They hurt you. I was afraid it would make you lose faith." Grace shook her head gently. "I was never angry. Because if I had become like them, Evermont would have turned into nothing but a battlefield." She turned toward him, her eyes calm yet deep. "The only thing to fear is not being looked down on, but letting that make you someone you're not." Downstairs, Aaron Blake was meeting with the department heads. Everyone listened attentively as he spoke. "From this day forward, Evermont will be led not only by profit, but by principle, and that principle begins with Mrs. Grace Miller." He lifted his head, his tone strong and clear. "She doesn't have to raise her voice yet, everyone listens. She doesn't have to give orders yet, the entire building straightens when she walks by." Margaret, standing beside him, nodded slightly, a faint smile forming at the corner of her lips. "That's how true power works," she whispered. "It doesn't need to prove itself. It makes others see it." On the rooftop, the wind grew stronger. Grace gazed down at the city, now glowing like a sea of stars. Thomas gently touched her hand. "I remember you once said you didn't want to be the one who leads, only the one who guides." Grace smiled softly. "That's right. Because a leader can command, but a guide can change hearts." She paused for a moment, her voice dropping to a whisper. "The day they poured Coke on me, I realized something.